recording. The recording will be available online in 1 or 2 days on the Eurofins website, and a recording will also be sent to everyone in attendance. Questions in the queue that are not answered will be followed up, as I said, via email. And now I'd like to introduce our presenters today. Gary Huddleston is the American Feed Industry Association's Director of Feed Manufacturing and Regulatory Affairs. He oversees AFIA's efforts surrounding regulatory issues in animal food manufacturing involving the FDA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and the Department of Transportation. Gary assists in the development and coordination of AFIA's education and training programs, and he joined AFIA in 2015. He has an extensive background in the feed industry's manufacturing sector. Krista Riggi is the Senior Operations Manager for Eurofins Food Safety Services. She oversees Eurofins' efforts in outreach for training and education and has been actively involved in the Safe Food, Safe Feed certification program since its launch with Eurofins in 2012. She has her Bachelor's of Science in Chemistry and her Master's in Business Administration. At this time, I will hand it over to Krista Riggi to give you a brief introduction of Eurofins, and then we will get into our code evaluation for Safe Food, Safe Feed version 7. Krista?
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Gary, for being here today. Eurofins is a global company and has a global reach. On this map here, you are able to see where we have locations within the United States. We are headquartered for food in Iowa, and we service the food, pharma, environmental, and clinical industries. In Eurofins, we have additional training in addition to our free webinar series. We have public courses that are held throughout the United States in certification schemes such as SQF, CRC, FFSC 22000, as well as in internal food safety audit training, good laboratory practice, and microbiology 101. We also offer services in consulting, where our experts go out into the manufacturing site and review your processes and help you to improve and find solutions to food safety problems that you're experiencing within the plant. And we also offer certification services through our certification body. All certifications with AFIA, Eurofins is able to conduct, and looking for partnerships to help complete those. In addition to the AFIA programs, Eurofins is also accredited to certified to SQF, FFSC 22000, PMEQS, and BRC. Eurofins employs and uses experts in the field that are competent and consistent. We work towards maintenance of our auditors and our consultants' competencies through continuing education, as well as we have available industry experts, offer competitive pricing, and have a full service and global approach to any food safety needs that you may need, as well as expert personalized customer attention to answer any questions that you may have as you're undergoing your food safety goals. With that, I'll turn it over to Gary. Gary, if you would like to go ahead and help us present on the Safe Feed, Safe Food scheme and requirements.
Okay, thank you, Krista, and glad to have everybody on this webinar this morning. And we're going to cover just a brief introduction about FSMA, and then we're going to look at the guidance document, the new Safe Feed, Safe Food FSC 36 7.0 guidance document that we just released in June, and talk through some of the changes. Next slide, please. Okay. So very quickly, this is going to be our agenda. We're going to do a real quick review of the Safe Feed, Safe Food, or the Food Safety Modernization Act, and then we're going to spend most of the time on the webinar looking at the old versus the new in the guidance document, and then entertain some questions. If you have questions, feel free to type those in as we move along. So briefly on FSMA, we realized that was signed into law in January of 2011, and mainly because there was a opportunity for improvement in our food safety system. And you can see some of the stats on the screen there. 1 in 6 million Americans are sickened each year, 128,000 hospitalized, and 3,000 die each year from a foodborne illness. And so FDA's seen a need to change our food safety system. And this has been identified as the most sweeping change in reform of the food safety laws in over 70 years. And the goal has been changed now from responding to contamination to preventing it. And so that's, as we move along, you can realize that's the goal. It was first signed into law in January of 2011. In October of 2013, the first version was of the rule was issued, a proposed rule, and many comments were sent back to FDA at that time. The second version of the proposed rule or revised rule was issued in September of 2014, and again received a lot of comments over the next several months. And then in 2015, the final rule was published. One of the main things to keep in mind is the compliance dates, and FDA decided to allow industry and stagger the compliance dates for the size of businesses. And you can see the chart on the screen that the top line is basically what we call large businesses, and they should already, if you're a large business of which is over 500 full-time employees, then you should already be in compliance with Subpart B, the CGMP requirements. And then you'll be required to have your hazard analysis and your food safety plan in place in September of this year, 2017. If you're a small business, which is less than 500 employees, you have an extra year to get in compliance. So you would need to have your be in compliance with the CGMPs in September of this year, and then have your hazard analysis and food safety plan a year from now in September 2018. Very small businesses, which would be less than $2.5 million sales, would be have one extra year on top of that. So if you're looking at who needs to comply to FSMA, and basically it's everybody. If that manufactures, processes, packs, or holds animal food for consumption within the United States. And in general, that's all facilities that must register under Section 415 of the FDA's Cosmetic Act, which is the Bioterrorism Act. And so if you have to register under the Bioterrorism Act, you have to comply with FSMA. And keep in mind that not complying is considered a prohibited act by FDA. One other thing to keep in mind is other CGMP regulations, such as the medicated feed rules or low acid canned feed rules. They don't go away with FSMA. FSMA is in addition to these requirements. These are the 6 major sections on the screen for the animal food rule. I'm not going to go over these in detail, but you can see the major subparts there that is included. And so just to keep in mind, again, the goal is to develop a proactive program to reduce potential animal food safety risks versus a reactive approach, which is what we've had in the past. The end result's going to be that more facilities are probably going to obtain a third-party certification, such as our FSC 36 Safe Eat, Safe Food program, to help ensure compliance with FSMA. And FDA has said that certified facilities such as this are considered a lower risk. So for the remainder of my presentation, we're going to talk about the changes with the new guidance document 7.0 that was released in June this year. The good news is that the requirements aren't changing, but the expectations relative to FSMA compliance have been made clear in this guidance. The committee's seen the need to align our guidance document and our program up closer to FSMA. There's many more direct references to FSMA, to the FSMA animal food rule requirements. One of the things that we've seen, the committee seen as they were after the animal food rule was released, is that there seemed to be some gaps there, especially in the language. One example would be the CGMP requirements. Even though most of the requirements that are in Subpart B of FSMA were called out in the old version, we decided to specifically call those out and give it a subsection entirely of its own. Records requirements were covered a little bit more in detail, and then the specific food safety plan and preventive control language that's in FSMA has been added to the new guidance document. Auditing guidance was removed. This was a point of confusion for companies and as well as auditors, and so in the new version we took this out. We left in the implementation guidance. The plan is that to develop a standalone document later on for auditing guidance that can be changed or added to as a completely separate document, and this document will help auditors maintain consistency, improve their quality of the audits. References to clauses have been updated. There was some confusion in that, and you can see in the first bullet point there in the old version, an example of this would be section 2.3 of the old version. That's auditing duration guide. But then when you look into the scheme requirements, which is in section 5, 2.3 equals document control. And so that kind of led to a little bit of confusion. And so the committee decided that in the new version, in section 5, which is the scheme requirements, we put SFSF in front of all the clause requirements, and so you'll see that change in the new document. So this chart gives you a kind of a comparison for version 7.0 and 6.1. You can see there's not a lot of changes, and there's 84 clauses. In the new 7.0 version, there were 77 in the old one. Most of the difference there is the 9 clauses that were added as the new subsection covering the CGMP requirements. On our website, the new guidance document is available along with the audit checklist, so you can go to the website to get these documents if you haven't already done so. So the remainder of our time, we're going to kind of walk through and focus on section 5 of the guidance document. There's not any changes in the rest of in the first 4 sections, but in section 5 is the scheme requirements, and we're going to walk through those and talk about what changes that have been implemented in each individual section. So subsection 1 of section 5 is management commitment and responsibility. The objective here is to ensure that management commitment and engagement within the quality and the animal food safety program. And there were no changes in the new guidance document. It all remains the same as the old. Subsection 2 is quality and feed safety management system. The objective here is to ensure this facility maintains the tools to implement an effective quality and animal food safety program. One change we made was took away the clause requiring quality and food safety manual, and then we updated the subsection or clause 2.4, which includes the records, and we updated that with the more detailed FSMA language that's included in subpart F of FSMA. And as we said before, we wanted to cover very specifically the new clauses that needed to be added for CGMP requirements, and align that up with subpart B of FSMA. And so we added a brand new subsection, which is subsection 3, and that section is called FSMA CGMP requirements. And if you're familiar with subpart B of FSMA, you can probably pretty quickly notice that these individual clauses very closely line up with the different sections of subpart B. The objective here is just to ensure that the facility complies with these FSMA CGMP requirements, and then to have a more effective, less emphasis on records in this section, as we know, in subpart B of FSMA, but more emphasis on just the observations. And all new clauses, these are all new clauses, and they were taken directly from the language of FSMA. Subsection 4 is personnel and training. The objective here is to ensure that the personnel are properly prepared, facilities are adequate, and that the visitors are controlled. Within this section, we added the new requirements for the preventive controls qualified individuals. This is a new requirement within FSMA, and so we added that and that's clause 4.2. Subsection 5 is infrastructure, and we removed sections 4.1, 4.2.1, and 4.2, which covers facility construction, equipment, and exterior. Those are covered in pretty good detail in the CGMP section, so we removed them from this infrastructure section so that we wouldn't be doubling up. And the goal here, objective of this subsection, is to ensure that the facility is properly designed and maintained for its intended purposes, and ensure that the work areas are sufficient and pest management is properly implemented. Subsection 6 is product realization. It's a long section, the longest section within the scheme, and there were no changes in product realization. You can see all the different categories of the sub clauses there in that section. And the goal here, the objective, is to ensure that food safety concerns are considered and records maintained for developing products, receiving materials, and then manufacturing finished products within the facility, and ensure that the appropriate information is exchanged between the facility and the customer. And then the last thing is to ensure that the food safety is maintained during storage. Subsection 7 covers purchasing, processing, and controls, and there was no changes made in this section. The objective here is to ensure that the processes are implemented for vendor or supplier approval, and that the appropriate communications are maintained to provide the desired materials. Subsection 7 is validation and verification. There were a few changes made in here, just minor adjustments to adjust for FSMA language. We changed some things in responsibility, frequency, and methods. Updated the validation section with the FSMA language, and then changed a few things in verification of implementation and effectiveness, again, to line up with the FSMA language. The main thing here is to ensure that the appropriate validation and verification is complete for equipment, monitoring devices, and finished products. In the second part of the validation and verification, which is 8.6 and beyond, there weren't any changes made here. And the goal of these additional clauses is we wanted to make sure we covered internal auditing, product identification, traceability, and to ensure that animal food safety, defense, or biosecurity plans developed and in place at the facility. Subsection 9 is the animal food safety plan, and we made quite a few changes here, updated each one of the clauses with the FSMA language to match subpart B of the animal food rule. Again, the goal here is to ensure that an animal food safety plan has been developed and is in place and working at the facility. And just a word of caution that going back to our chart, the animal food safety plan is not required by FSMA for large businesses until September of this year, and small businesses it will be September of 2018. And the last section, subsection, is the Safe Feed, Safe Food seal requirements, and there were no changes here, and this subsection just covers the compliance with the licensing agreement. The goal is to make sure the logo is used properly and that proper statements are provided on all the packaging and labels. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Krista, and she's going to cover some other requirements.
Thanks, Gary. Certainly going for certification and looking at the changes, I want to talk a little bit about steps to implementing those changes and how to make it a fluid movement from one code to the next code. Some quick tips on how to go about implementing version 7.0 is to understand and document those changes. And step one to understanding those changes are here in this webinar, and Gary did a wonderful job going through each of the new highlights and what was contributing to the updates in the code. The next would really be to develop a plan based on those changes to see what in your documents do need to be altered to come into compliance with the updated criteria, and then establishing some timelines around those of when you'd like to get those done, and certainly how to prepare for your next audit with that timeline in mind. The next is involve your senior leadership, get their engagement and their involvement and their buy-in to some of the decisions that you're making as far as the updating of the criteria and what you'd like to do in order to establish all of those different new techniques in order to come into compliance with the code, assign new roles, and who is going to update those documents. That'll be very important. As we know, that quality is not a one-man job. It takes a team effort in order to get everything updated and documented and planned out. And then the next step is really the implementation. Training your staff on all of the updates of the documents and what has occurred. And then highly recommended is to perform an internal audit about 30 days prior to your re-audit window, and that's just to make sure that all elements are covered. What I would suggest doing is pulling off a copy of the Safe Use, Safe Food checklist, which can be found on the AFIA website, and using that tool, going down through the different items and measuring your quality system against that and how you comply. As a certification body, we do not want anything to be a surprise. We only audit to the criteria that is within the standard. But if you do have any questions, reach out to AFIA or your certification body, and I know that they'd be glad to help you address and understand any of those requirements as well. That's a little bit about how to implement the new changes. I do want to go through a little bit about the certification, and as many of you know, this is a 2-year certification, and it really applies in 2 years. There's some level of audit activity. On the first year, that's really an on-site audit where about 80 or so questions are evaluated on-site using the full checklist. And it's looking at how is your documentation in place, and then how is it implemented in the facility? How is your facility taking what's on paper, and are they doing what you said they'd be doing? So that's really what the on-site audit looks like, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of those expectations from an on-site audit. On year 2, there is a remote audit or a surveillance year, as some call it, but the remote audit is generally a bit shorter and is done off-site, and we'll talk about what that is. Now, there are some ways that that remote audit on the second year can turn into an on-site audit, and really some of those options to do that is if it's elected or chosen by the supplier to have that be an on-site audit. That's completely understandable. Sometimes the facilities like to see an on-site inspection every year to view how in compliance they are to that standard. If you do change your certification body on that remote year, it is recommended to also change that remote audit to an on-site audit. And that really just helps to evaluate your new system and to get familiar with the documents and programs that you have in place. Or due to the results of the year 1, if you receive a score between 70 and 85 percent or a compliance, the standard does require that remote audit or surveillance audit to be turned into an on-site audit. And just as a quick reminder, Safety Safe Food uses the Reliance software system in order to conduct and complete the audit. All audit activity occurs within that software system, and that is also where corrective actions will be managed and supplied throughout that database if there are any findings. There is a re-registration of $250 each year, so just a reminder to make sure that you have that sign up so that you are ready for your audit to take place. I want to move into what you can expect from an on-site audit. These generally take about 8 hours. More time may be added due to size of the facility or complexity of the operation, but in general we're seeing in 8 hours is a good time frame in order to be able to collect all of the observations and to help review compliance of the facility to the audit criteria. Prior to the audit, you can expect an audit plan via email, and that's really to outline, what we're going to look at, what's going to be covered, help plan in the preparation so that way your site can have the documents ready and you can have the proper guides in place, as well as just be prepared and understand, who needs to be available and when. During the opening meeting, we're going to review that schedule, and we can flex that schedule depending on your production schedule and when you have different members of your team available. So if you have something come up during that day, we understand life happens and operations happen, and we need to accommodate those. So we can really address those during the opening meeting and work around you in order to complete that audit. In the opening meeting, it's really going to set out, what we're going to do for the day while we're at the location, walking around the facility, who we're going to talk to. All those good things are all pinned out, and that's a great time for any questions over the audit if you have any prior to getting started. During the audit, our auditors are there to look for compliance to the standard. They're looking for, how are we in compliance? And that's really done through collecting the objective evidence through interview with production workers and how they do their job, looking at records and general observation from standing back on the floor and reviewing how your staff interacts with feed safety. If there are any findings, those are really shown to the guide or whoever's with the auditor at the time that they occur, so there are no surprises. And we can work through, this is what we're seeing and this is what the criteria is, and we can talk through then, whether or not it's in compliance or not. And then again, those are summarized in the closing meeting with all next steps talked about and reviewed, so you know what's the next phases. So that's really what an on-site audit occurs, how it can demonstrate. I do want to talk just briefly about surveillance audits and remote audits. So these are conducted off-site, and they generally take about 3 to 4 hours. The checklist is condensed from the on-site audit, and it's roughly about 35 to 40 questions, and it's all the mandatory items that you find in the full checklist. It's there to review the documents, not necessarily the implementation of the documents, but are those documents still healthy and in compliance with that code? There's some options that are available for conducting the remote or surveillance audit. We can do that through a general share screen where we navigate through the facility documents. The facility pulls up the different documents that need to be reviewed, and those are looked at on screen by our auditor as well as the facility on site, so they can, on the phone, so they can answer any questions that they have and really nail any of that down. There is another option for the facility to send the documents to the certification body, in which time our auditor would review those remotely and on a scheduled time that they would have. We would want to schedule a scheduled time for the facility to interact with the auditor for about 1 hour's time, just to make sure that any questions that come up or arose, or if there were any missing documents, that we'd be able to get all of that captured within the audit. Or the facility also has the option to elect to conduct an on-site audit, and that is perfectly fine if the site would like to do that. Some post-audit expectations. At the closing meeting of the audit, you'll be left with a draft summary of the nonconformities so that you can begin to put into place corrective actions right away. You don't have to wait on the official final audit report. About 10 days following the audit is when you can expect to see that report in Reliance. And it's also when you're going to be able to start to place corrective actions within Reliance. And as you move those forward, the auditor is going to take a look at those and help to see if those are now in compliance and the evidence supplied is within the standard. So corrective action, if there are any findings, are due within Reliance based upon the rating of the finding. There are majors and there are minors. And majors are really a full, complete breakdown of a system, where minors are just something one-off that the system's in place, the system's working, but in this case, that particular record or that particular aspect wasn't in compliance with the full system that you have in place at your site. And those are due within 30 days, and majors are due within 14 days. We do expect evidence such as a photograph or an updated document or a PO or something to show that that corrective action has been complete or being worked on. Following that, the corrective actions and the report will be reviewed for a certificate decision, and that will be completed and done within 45 days following the audit, and that will be sent direct to the facility with a mailed copy. We do have some exciting news. AFIA has updated the certificate template, and I've got a picture of the new certificate look up here on the screen, and so that's going to be something that you're going to see as a change going forward, and really not a big change other than it's got a brand new look to it. With that, I'll turn it over to Sarah, and I really appreciate your time and listening today to our webinar, and I can't thank AFIA and Gary enough for helping us to put on this webinar and to help understand the new requirements of version 7.0 of the Safe Food Code.
You said it, Krista. I thank you, Krista and Gary, both for taking time to go through this information with everyone who is registered today. Like I said, we will reach out via email to answer all of the questions that have been submitted throughout the presentation, and a digital recording of this webinar will be available online and sent via email to every person who registered for the presentation. With that, I'll give one final thank you to Gary Huddleston and Krista Riggi, and we will conclude our presentation.